live session, we just want to continue or a bit on what we started yesterday, the story I was able to share with you and we're able to discuss. And thank you for getting to discuss with me the way you did. And I just want to reiterate a few things you said, is that you really mentioned that environment is really a big factor when it comes to, dealing with uh, trauma and dealing with different life experiences,
Yeah.
and how both of these individuals that we were talking about, even though mainly we're talking about the child from the perspective of the child, the two other main characters were the mother and the father. The mother, as I told you, was in another country. The father was still doing the things that he was doing. So you mentioned that one was more growth oriented mindset, the lady, but the man was more, did not have a growth oriented mindset. Was actually just
We
wanted
call it
to
a fixed mindset. Yeah.
fixed mindset, exactly, where he just wanted to stay where he was and where we had met him the whole time. And just to give an update on the particular story of the young, not he's not a young man, he grew to a certain age, but just recently, after a long battle of some complications due to the drinking, he unfortunately passed away. And he passed away before he got to see his child, who is still growing up abroad. And
Oh wow.
hopefully, we believe that the mother did make efforts to come and give her last respects together with the child. So it really can be something to think about. How this story ends is that the last time we get to see this child from her perspective is she gets to see that all the efforts of her mother hasn't borne any fruit, and the father, who evidently wasn't present in her life, is now cannot be present at all. The chance has been completely taken away from her. And there's also so much we can actually take from that, whereby how will she take this news as a naive child, as also a child who is going through different cultures, as an African child, but growing up in the UK? Does she have a support system? It's just the mother. She didn't know anything about the father's side of the family. So what is her support system? How will she process this across cultures? And Nicholas, you were just sharing with me that there's a book you are reading that can really help
Yeah.
us to uh, understand this situation even better. If you could share with us, please.
Yes. Sorry, I forgot to take the book, so I won't go in the other room to take it. But it's called Third Culture Kid. It's a very voluminous book, and it's all about basically children of parents who move abroad to work or to do missionary work or for military reasons or as an ambassador and so on. Whatever the reason, the parent moves to another country mainly for work, and the children have to follow in this critical period of development between 0 and 18. So if you have experienced that, then you are a third culture kid. So go and Google it if you haven't heard about it before. Very interesting topic, very voluminous book, because there is a lot of complexity. And the reason why it is an important subject is because I was trying to make this slide today for a client that I have, is because what we see of culture when we migrate to a new place is always the tip of the iceberg. As you can see on this slide, we won't go into the details of this slide, but you can see the tip of the iceberg, and you can see, as we know usually, that the bottom part of the iceberg is much, much bigger, right? And that's exactly what how culture presents itself. When we move to another country, when we go and visit another country, what do we see? We eat the food, right? We see people driving around differently. We see if there is public transports or not, or what kind of transportations there is for people to get around. We see dances and music and festivals. We see performances of all sorts, right? We see ancient derelicts and so on. What we do not see is the majority of what constitutes a culture. And these are the hidden rules about how you should behave, notions of friendship and and how to be close to somebody, and family and beauty and leadership, and approaches to religion and death and illness. And then, which all stem, by the way, out of the core values of that particular culture. So when we move overseas, there's this incredible complexity that we are met with. And here we have the case of a child, and we mostly look at the child because she's in the critical stage of development, right? She's 15. She's barely past the puberty period.
Yeah.
And so here it is. This child is confronting this complexity, is confronting this incredible amount of new details in her life during a period in which she has been separated from her friends. She has been separated from her communities, uncles, sisters, cousins, right? She has been separated from the things that are familiar, the foods that are familiar to her, because maybe she can eat some African food over there, but probably not from Kenya. Or if it is from Kenya, it's going to be much more expensive and not accessible as it is in Kenya, right?
Yeah.
And then in all of that, the grief of the neglect that comes out of basically a father that was absent because he had to choose the bottle over everything else he loved, right? It doesn't mean that this man did not love his daughter, that did not love his wife, that did not love his brothers and sisters, but at the end of the day, the biggest part of him chose to drink and not to spend time with these people, right? And so one of the really common factors in my client work with either people who suffer from addiction or children of parents that were addictive is essentially neglect, a sense that you are not seen, a sense that you are not really connected. So we have this background, and she moves to this country, she meets this complexity, the mother is trying, she's not able to bring him to England, and then now basically finally and very unfortunately the father dies. I mean, this is not a pretty story. And from a sort of very classical point of view, from the ACE point of view, we would only talk about the alcoholism of the father, and we wouldn't even tick off the box of separation or divorce because it's not an official separation or divorce. But when we do explore a little bit the story, look how much more there is to the pain that this child might be carrying, right? Our ability to digest pain, to process pain, is so connected to us feeling safe. And how can you feel safe when all your routines have been changed, the way that you nurture yourself through friends and food that you know, right? Friends and food that you know, and family that you know, has changed completely. You are in a country now at the bottom of the social hierarchy, like totally at the bottom of the social hierarchy, because you are an immigrant. On top of that, you're a Black immigrant. So how can you feel safe? So the pain grows, and what would be the norm for this child is that she will not have a chance to express that pain. That only much later on in her life, if she manages to reconstitute some form of strong familiarity around her, then she will be able to address the pain of her losses.
And I and seeing this very elaborate graph diagram you have here, I'm seeing at the very bottom is the approaches to marriage, religion, and marriage, religion, and death. That's almost at the tip of the bottom. So it really shows that as who she is as an immigrant, would you say that that information of how this culture that she's now in, that she's trying to operate in, this is information she will never get? because the people who are supposed to show her this is okay, you lost your father, this is how we deal with it in this society, and will help you, facilitate you go through it, she will never experience that, because the levels and the layers that she has to go through, it's too gate, I would say almost she's rejected in every stop. Like there are checkpoints and she's rejected in every spot before you find someone who is your friend, someone that is not just your friend, gets to be a close confidant, because it's not information you just go around telling anyone that, oh, guys, I lost my, hello, I'm an immigrant and help me because I lost my father. That doesn't work like that.
That's good how you put it. Yes, it's so ridiculous what you just said.
Yeah.
That really
Yeah.
highlights, the real issue here. Yes. Yes. You
So,
can't go to school and say, I just migrated to this country and I lost my father. How do I deal with this? Like it's absurd. No, nobody can do that. Because why? The main reason is because you don't open up like this unless you feel safe, unless you know that the people around you are going to hold you, right? Are going to be there with you when you break down, because when you break down, your cognition breaks down. When you become very emotional, if you let yourself be very emotional, your cognition breaks down. If your cognition breaks down, how do you take care of yourself? You're very vulnerable. If somebody wants to bully you in that moment, you have no defense mechanisms turned on, unless you suddenly become aggressive, but that's going to cause different problems, right? Yeah. If we look at our traditional slide here, we can't really say officially that this person carries a heavy amount of trauma, because as we said so far, in terms of the questions we have covered, she only ticks one, right? We don't know of any history of abuse, psychological or physical, even though we know that with alcoholism, some of these things come along. Not always, absolutely not always, but there is a degree of violence sometimes that comes along with that. So definitely neglect, and definitely the issue of the alcohol being present with one parent. So that's 2 ticks. That's not that much. So you could call it simple, but when we add in the layer of moving to another country and losing the father as you are away, and her being in a critical age of development, then it starts to be a complex situation. Right? For me, that's really on the edge between a sort of a straightforward, simple case of trauma and a complex one. And is it typical? Is it atypical? Is quite typical nowadays, because movement between countries and migration to other regions of the world to find work is becoming so typical. Is there a shock there? Well, we if we go back to the slides on culture, we know that there is a cultural shock when you move to another country. We talk of a shock. It's a culture shock, right? To meet certain realities. So there is shock involved, and there is developmental trauma involved because of the losses at this critical period of development. Yeah. So I guess today we can move on with the next question, René. And let's try to bring it in. Yeah, thank you. So often or very often, okay. My parent caregiver was often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at him or her. Sometimes often or very often kicked, beaten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or knife. So really what this question is about, René, is violence done onto someone that you care about and where you are a witness, right? We have been talking about violence, all sorts of different violence, psychological, emotional, physical, and now we are going back on this topic of violence, but we are looking at it from the perspective of me being a witness to some violence that is being done on somebody I love.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a very interesting question, whereby we are seeing from the perspective of the child not being the victim of the violence, but seeing it happen to someone that is supposed to take care of them. So um, I have a couple of anecdotes, and I think maybe from the story and getting to read this question with you, I'm curious, should we take it from the perspective that this child already has some connection with the parental caregiver, or has a connection with the, because if it is someone you care about that is being beaten, um, many of the times the child may want to intervene. But if it's someone you're disconnected with, and this is happening, is it possible for the child to feel disconnected from the situation? That these are just two individuals who had me, none of them show me love, and none of them show love to each other. So it kind of makes sense. So, should we? What is the context of what we should see from the point of the child?
It's a very, very good question. So primarily the question is hinting at you suffering the consequences of vicarious trauma. So when somebody is being beaten and abused over and over, there is a form of trauma there involved. Again, because if we go back to the basics of trauma, trauma is simply a state of the mind whereby your amygdala, your emotional system is hyperactive, hyper alert constantly, right? So your level of cortisol are always higher than they would be normally, because you are always in fight and flight. So obviously, if someone is being, threatened with physical violence over and over, they're in fight and flight most of the time, if not all the time. And now, as a child who is dependent on that person, whether it's because you are the little brother of the sister or brother that is getting beaten a lot, or the little sister, or because you are the child of, one of the parents that is getting beaten, you are vicariously, through the empathic system of our brain, absorbing the violence. When you see your mother or your father being, thrown objects at and being hit at with these objects, um, or even just with, slaps and punches and kicks and so on, which happens on both sides, right? It's not always a man towards a woman, although in most cases men will express violence with physical expressions. But in either case, you as a child, you know how sensitive you are to anything happening to your parents, right? And so it doesn't matter if it's another parent doing that, you will indeed, as you mentioned, try to intervene. It's so instinctive. The child always tries to preserve the happiness and the emotional balance of the parents, and ultimately to rectify or correct the imbalances between the parents' relationship. So by this nature, the child will always end up being a receiver and absorber, if not of a secondary nature, of the conflict and the violence in particular in this case. Now, in the case, I know that, for example, I have a client currently whose parent also was an alcoholic and who also died of overdose, not long ago, actually. But the father left the family when he was very young, when the child was very young. And the mother spoke of this man very negatively. So the child was actually allowed to see, or we could say the father was allowed to see the child throughout his development. Um, but as the client that I have recounts it, he saw that as a chore. He never saw that as an opportunity to connect with the father. And so there is a degree of intrinsic violence in this scenario. First of all, the abrupt leaving of one parent, that entails a degree of violence. Why? Because it's something abrupt, unexplained, and difficult to process, difficult to understand, right? There's a suddenness to it, like sudden death is more violent than slow death, right? And then there is psychological and emotional violence embedded in a mother, and I don't know the details here, or I wouldn't be able to reveal them for confidentiality issues, but a mother or a father that speaks negatively, constantly negatively about the other parent in such a way that the child finds no opportunity to feel joy or a desire for connection with the other parent, entails that there is violence in the process. So the child, even though there is no physical violence, but the child, again, is just to underline how central the issue of the child always is, because he or she will always absorb whatever the parent is giving. So if the child in this case is absorbing the mother's telling him or her that the other parent is such a bad person, that's a form of violence that the child is absorbing.
Yeah, actually, that's so true, because see, we are out of time, but I had an anecdote I would share.
Yes.
Something that we can share on. I don't know if we can actually pick up on it next time. Since you already built on the context of it, but I actually have a couple of stories that we can build on to better understand this concept, and that good question that we can leave our viewers. We have one viewer on the chat. Thank you so much for
Hey.
joining.
Thank you for joining.
And something that we can actually reflect on as we get to discuss and analyze this particular subject, also in accordance with the trauma pie chart that we have actually still have all through. So thank you, Nicholas, for joining me for this conversation. We will actually pick up next week. Thank you again for those who are subscribed, are able to see anytime we go live, especially when we have guests. This week we had a very entertaining and great time with Helen. So make sure, guys, you are able to see it on the same place, All About Trauma. And let's catch up again next week. Thank you, Nicholas.
I wanted to mention, René, that we haven't had really the chance to open up the Q&A for viewers that come online, and that's because we haven't really had a regular following, and we don't know, with one viewer following there, if they would be open to ask a question or not. But you can get in touch with us if you have a question. We can coordinate that. We would love to answer questions coming from the public. So with that said, let's try to do that next week. Thank you very much, René. Thank you everyone for coming and for watching this. All About Trauma will be next week here on Saturday around 1 p.m. GMT +3, and whatever time that is in your area.